And academic Jay Tharappel from Sydney. Thanks so much for joining us, Jay, on
Thank you for
a
having me.
Sunday. Yeah, thank you. Um, I know there's so much talk about the war in Ukraine at the moment, but we can't forget that the war in Yemen is continuing apace, with involvement from the British government, of course. For those who don't know you and your involvement in the war in Yemen activism, can you just give us a bit of a background about yourself and how you became interested in this topic?
Well, I first got involved agitating against the war on Syria, which is when I really started putting myself out there as a public figure. I started paying attention to Yemen around 2017, 2018, when I saw a comment on my wall from a Yemeni who said words to the effect of, you write a lot about Syria, but could you please write about Yemen because our people are suffering? And, it's true, the people of Yemen have suffered the worst humanitarian crisis for the past 7 years since the war began. And that's because the Saudis are using starvation as a weapon against the Yemeni people by preventing food shipments from reaching Yemen. So I spent months researching Yemen, gave over a dozen interviews with Marwa Usman from Press TV, who's a friend of mine. I also made 2 videos about the history of Yemen in early 2020, which you can find on my YouTube channel. I've written about 17 articles on Yemen for my website, theorientaldespot.com, although right now the website doesn't look too good because I'm in the process of rebuilding it. And last year, I wrote a piece for The Cradle, which is a publication started by Sharmin Narwani, a very brilliant journalist. And the article is titled "Why a Checkmate is Looming for the Saudis in Yemen." So now that I've pretty much finished writing my PhD thesis, I hope to have more time doing media work, particularly on Yemen. So thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. It's important to not forget these humanitarian crises. Just because some new thing pops up and everyone sort of seems to just jump on whatever the mainstream narrative of the moment is and forget about everything else that's happening in the world. So yeah, thanks again for joining us. Can you give us some background on the war in Yemen for those of you who haven't heard much about it?
The war became internationalized in the sense that it drew in foreign states in March 2015 when the UN Security Council passed UN Resolution 2216. The resolution declared that Saudi Arabia was invited by the official government of Yemen, headed by President Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, to defeat the so-called Houthi rebels who had taken power in the capital Sana'a in what I would say was the only genuine, popular, and relatively bloodless revolution of the Arab Spring. That's the revolution that took place on the 21st of September 2014. Also, Hadi, who's recognized as the legitimate president, he resigned as president in January 2015. So the very premise of UN Resolution 2216, which is that the Saudis represent the president of Yemen, was a complete lie. The resolution was tabled by the UN Security Council, tabled at the UN Security Council by France, the US, the UK, and Russia and China. They could have vetoed this resolution, but they chose not to, thereby legalizing the war on Yemen in the eyes of the UN. In terms of the total death toll, I mean, according to the UN, around 377,000 people have died in Yemen because of this war. 70% of that death toll are children under the age of 5. 60% of that death toll was because of starvation and disease. And the remaining 40% of that death toll was caused by direct military violence like air raids or frontline combat. So according to the UN, even though this war is causing widespread malnutrition across Yemen, where over 15 million people are living in extreme poverty, the Saudi-led coalition are technically not invaders. And that goes to show that ethics and legality are two different things. That which is legal isn't always moral, and that which is moral isn't always legal. Because on one side in Yemen, you have the Yemeni National Resistance, which is 100% indigenous to Yemen. But in the media, they're referred to as, Iranian-backed rebels or proxies, as if there's something foreign about them. Whereas the Saudi-led coalition is dominated by foreign troops, including 150,000 Saudi troops, as well as military aid and naval support from the Anglo-American alliance. So that would mean that about 84% of the armed strength of the so-called legitimate government of Yemen is completely foreign. So, on the one side, you've got the Yemeni resistance, which is 100% indigenous, and that includes the Yemeni army. So the Yemeni army defected to the side of the Ansarullah or Houthi revolution in September 2014. And that's the point. They are 100% indigenous Yemeni. On the other side, you've got this coalition of foreign countries and foreign mercenaries, 150,000 Saudi troops, Anglo, US military aid and naval support. There's mercenaries from Sudan, Senegal, Morocco, Bahrain, Kuwait, Egypt, Jordan, Germany, France. I mentioned France, I guess, but and then the UAE as well, right? So that goes to show you that the words that they use to describe this war can be very deceiving, since this mostly foreign mercenary force is referred to as the legitimate government in the media.
Mm. And I mean, we've seen throughout history that something deemed legal is also a matter of politics. It's not really some kind of objective designation. I mean, seeing the Yemeni resistance, there's put up a heroic fight really in this sort of David and Goliath battle. Can you tell us a bit more about the events leading up to the revolution, the Houthi revolution in 2014?
Sure. So in Yemen, the Arab Spring protests, that's the common kind of event in history that most people look to. There were protests across the Arab world. In hindsight, I believe we can say that these protests were largely part of the agenda of countries like Turkey and Qatar. They wanted to pull off color revolutions to bring Muslim Brotherhood governments to power, but only in the Arab republics, not the Arab monarchies. And so similarly in Yemen, there were protests against the president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been in power for 33 years. And he came to power following the assassination of Ibrahim al-Hamdi, who was the president of North Yemen. He was like a genuine, progressive Arab nationalist, modernizing president. And, he represented a threat to the Saudis because he had good relations with South Yemen. South Yemen was ruled by President Salim al-Rubai, and together, Rubai and Hamdi were discussing the prospect of Yemen unifying. And this worried the Saudis, and so they assassinated him. So President Ibrahim al-Hamdi was assassinated, and his assassination is what paved the way for the 33-year reign of President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was a corrupt pro-Saudi ruler. He presided over the Wahhabization of Yemen. So even though he himself is a Zaydi Muslim, because of his ties to Saudi Arabia, he allowed Saudi Arabia to turn Yemen into a very Wahhabi country. So he supported the growth of Wahhabi mosques, particularly the Dar al-Hadith al-Kathriya in Damaj in the northern part of Yemen, which is where the Zaydis are from. That's like the Zaydi heartland. And during the period of Saleh's rule, Yemen exported quite a lot of mercenaries to Afghanistan to fight against the socialist government there. And when they returned, they killed socialists. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the unification of Yemen, which was really on the terms of the North under President Saleh, he had to neutralize the socialists in the South because he wanted, complete control over South Yemen. And so he used those same, Yemenis who had gone to fight in Afghanistan. They came back and they brought Al-Qaeda to Yemen. And so he teamed up with Al-Qaeda to murder the socialists in South Yemen and carried out hundreds of assassinations. And the only group that actually stood up for the socialists at this time was a group called Hizb al-Haq. And it's one of its members, one of its parliamentarians, was Hussein al-Houthi, and he ended up founding the Ansarullah movement. Yeah. So fast forward to 2004, and Ansarullah is gaining popularity because they're pushing back against this Wahhabization of Yemen with Zaydi revivalism. And it's important to remember that Ansarullah did not take up arms against the Yemeni state. The Yemeni state took up arms against Ansarullah. The Yemeni state, under President Saleh, they responded to a political challenge from Ansarullah with brutal military force. So in Yemen, these are the conditions, like the wars against Ansarullah began in 2004. They ended in 2010. And these are the conditions that created the climate for the Arab Spring protests against Saleh. And in Yemen, these protests involved all the three major opposition political factions. You had the Yemeni Muslim Brotherhood, you had the Southern Movement, which flies the flag of the former South Yemen, but they're not the same as the Socialist Party. In fact, they include many former, Islamists and Mujahideen commanders who had fought in Afghanistan, like Tariq al-Fadli, for example, is the name of one. And, another political faction that took part in the protests against Saleh were, of course, the Ansarullah movement. So the Saudis in the US, they stepped in, they convinced Saleh to resign. And in 2012, he was replaced by his vice president, Abdurrab Mansour Hadi, who was then elected with only his name on the ballot. This is in 2012. And a new cabinet was formed, and it was dominated by ministers from the Islah Party, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. Saleh was promised immunity from prosecution. So he had committed horrific war crimes throughout his entire reign, first against the socialists, then against the Houthis or the Ansarullah movement. So he was like basically pushed aside. And, if you look at it, like this was all going according to the script. Because the script was that the Arab Spring was about bringing Muslim Brotherhood governments to power. And so the biggest beneficiaries of Saleh stepping down were the Muslim Brotherhood. But the thing is, the Hadi government, it was supposed to address the anti-corruption demands of the protesters. And these anti-corruption measures were common among all of the groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood, including the Southern Movement, and, especially the Ansarullah movement, who was spearheading the anti-corruption campaign. But instead of addressing these demands, he tried to federalize the country. And, the Ansarullah responded to the federalization by saying that this was a plan to divide Yemen into poor and wealthy regions. And the reason they did this is because the federalization of Yemen ultimately served Saudi interests. And the Saudis were the ones that pushed for Hadi to become the president of Yemen. Because if you think about it in terms of like Yemen's resources and geography and population centers, the parts of Yemen that have about 80% of the population, which is the northern wedge of Yemen, they have very few resources, whereas the parts of Yemen that have 20% of the population, they have 80% of the resources. So, 80% of the population has 20% of the resources, 20% of the population has 80% of the resources. And so if you grant autonomy to the resource-rich areas, then it becomes much easier for Saudi Arabia to cut deals with them, and then without having to deal directly with the central government. And so this is what sparked the revolution on the 21st of September, 2014. The straw that broke the camel's back was the fact that Hadi slashed the fuel subsidies, and this caused this was because of pressure from the IMF as well, and this caused fuel prices to increase by 200%. And so when Ansarullah seized control of the capital, Sana'a, the reason it was with relatively little bloodshed is because the Yemeni army declared support for the revolution. The Yemeni Interior Ministry said that Ansarullah was acting in the service of the general interests of the homeland. And the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, also declared his support for the revolution. I mean, that's also part of the reason, because he thought that this was a way for him to get back into power. And this is important to remember because previously Saleh had waged like 6 wars against Ansarullah. But then in December 2017, Saleh tried to defect back to the Saudi side, but then he was shot and killed. It has to be remembered that when Ansarullah took power in September 2014, they didn't try and just take everything for themselves. All political factions were involved in signing the Peace and National Partnership Agreement. And the UN was there to broker this agreement to form a new government. And, they went to work, on the anti-corruption agenda. They restored the subsidies to bring down the price of fuel. And the Houthis, the Southern Movement, the General People's Congress, which is the government of Hadi and Saleh, the government that the party that had been ruling Yemen for 33 years, they got positions in the cabinet as well as the Muslim Brotherhood. They also got positions in the cabinet. So Ansarullah did not try and take political power for themselves. The reason the government broke down was for various reasons. ultimately it was because Hadi was not willing to implement the agenda of that the vast majority of Yemenis wanted, because ultimately he was serving foreign interests. He then resigned in January 2015, and then 2 months later, Hadi arrived in Saudi Arabia, and that's when the war began. The Saudis claimed that they were acting on behalf of Hadi, who was the president, even though he had resigned 2 months earlier. And so UN Resolution 2216, which justifies the Saudi intervention, which is what it legally is, even though it's quite obviously an invasion. So UN Resolution 2216 legalizes the war against Yemen.
Even though the conditions that were present for that legality are no longer, no longer exist.
Yes, that's right.
Which is quite astonishing. But I mean, unsurprising considering, the forces within the war. I mean, there's been so much media attention and like virtue signaling at the moment directed towards Ukraine, support for Ukraine in the face of the Russian invasion. Can you speak a bit about the hypocrisy that you see in the Western media, who've basically hidden the genocide in Yemen from the people who live in countries whose governments are actually involved in the war in Yemen directly?
Sure. So we can ask two questions, why does Ukraine get so much attention and why does Yemen get almost no attention? Contrary to the popular leftist opinion, I don't think it has to do with skin color. I think it's more to do with geopolitics and imperialism. Yeah. So let's start with Ukraine. I mean, the purpose of presenting Ukraine as the good victim and Russia as the evil aggressor is to manufacture consent for the underlying strategy of NATO, which is to weaken Russia. And Russia knows this, which is why Russia treats Ukraine wanting to join NATO as a declaration of war against Russia. And quite frankly, who can blame Russia, especially when you consider that NATO was formed essentially as an anti-Russian military alliance? Another reason why Ukraine gets so much sympathy is because people in the West will have to endure higher fuel prices and higher inflation because of the sanctions on Russia, which is why the media is now telling everyone that if you're not willing to pay this price to save the Ukrainians from the evil Russians, then, you're responsible for the suffering of the Ukrainians. And so the propaganda is very important in getting people to support wars that go against their own interests. Now, the reason why Yemen, go ahead.
Sorry, and I was just, I saw a clip from, I think, Stephen Colbert the other night saying that he would be willing to pay $15 a gallon for petrol if it meant, he had his conscience clear. And then he said, oh, well, I drive a Tesla anyway. So, I mean, the attitude towards
totally out of touch.
It's completely out of touch. And, it's just so disconnected from reality of what people are facing, which is why, as you say, the propaganda is so strong. But yeah,
Colbert actually said something interesting. He said he was kind of like attuned to the fact that there was hypocrisy in America caring so much about Ukraine and wanting to sanction Russia while doing business with Saudi Arabia. But he didn't realize that it was a bit of a self-own.
Yeah, he was exposing himself and didn't. Yeah, so
yeah, and then like the NPC crowd just like clapped along anyway, right? But look, the reason Yemen gets zero media coverage, I think, is for two reasons. Firstly, there is no conceivable humanitarian pretext for why the West should support the Saudi-led coalition in prosecuting this war, especially when you consider that the West is on the same side as Al-Qaeda, which is not going to be popular with ordinary people. And if the media gave Yemen the coverage it deserves, then, people would instinctively side with Ansarullah and the Yemeni national resistance. And that's because what they would see is an indigenous national movement fighting against a foreign coalition that's trying desperately to impose a government on them that they don't want. And the second reason is because Yemen has very few allies. I mean, as far as I know, the only countries in the world that recognize the National Salvation Government of Yemen are Iran and Syria and maybe North Korea. Every other country essentially supports the Saudi genocide, including, sadly, many otherwise progressive Latin American countries like Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. And, we usually think of Russia and China as counter-hegemonic powers that support countries that are being bullied by the US. And in many cases, that is true, like, for example, in Syria. But not in the case of Yemen. So to give you an example, 2 weeks ago, the UN passed Resolution 2624. And this was to extend the already existing arms embargo on the Ansarullah-backed government in the capital, Sana'a. And it's a resolution that says that the National Salvation Government, the Yemeni National Resistance, that represents 70 to 80% of the Yemeni population, that governs that much of the population, has no right to defend itself against an army of foreigners. So it prevents them from getting weapons to defend themselves. And this resolution was supported by every member of the UN Security Council, the US, Britain, France, of course, but also Russia and China. So they have blood on their hands, as well as the non-permanent members, including India, the UAE, Albania, Gabon, Ghana, Kenya. Not a single country voted against that resolution. The only abstentions came from Brazil, Ireland, Mexico, and Norway. So I would say, this is Yemen's a country where I don't think in history so many countries have been complicit in a genocide. So Yemen is the type of country, I would say, that makes Syria and Palestine look kind of privileged by comparison, like as weird as it is to say that. I mean, at least Syria had the support of Russia and China, with the media networks of RT supporting Syria. And at least Palestine gets support from the media networks of Turkey, which is a NATO power. So at least Palestine can say that they have a NATO power supporting them, at least in terms of media. I mean, Turkey does, deal with Israel on the side and supports them economically and stuff. By contrast, the only country that supports Yemen is Iran, which is why most of the interviews that I've done about Yemen have been with Press TV. I mean, ultimately, the extent to which the lesson that I would draw here is that the extent to which we in the West are socialized by the media to feel sympathy for any nation has never been proportional to the suffering of that nation, and has always been dependent on the power of that nation or the usefulness of that nation to other powerful nations. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that you don't think people would side with the Yemeni people if this war was to be publicized, because they would see that, the Western powers are on the side of Al-Qaeda. But I guess in Ukraine, we're on the side of like neo-Nazis. And now the liberal media is trying to literally like rehabilitate Hitler, saying that Putin's worse than Hitler. I saw something yesterday, I think, from the Rachel Maddow blog that said, oh, well, at least Hitler didn't kill his own people, or he didn't kill ethnic Germans, which, I mean, it's like so untrue, but it's just like, how can you even say such a thing? So, yeah, I mean, I think the media is just such a powerful tool, and it can get the people to really support either side, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's neo-Nazis. But the main thing is that they won't get the public to support anyone who opposes NATO states or Western sort of hegemony.
Absolutely.
But specifically, like for British workers, what do you think is the most important thing for them to know about our government's complicity in the genocide on Yemen?
The British working class, as well as the working classes of all the Western countries that are sanctioning Russia right now, they should understand that if they want to save lives and bring down oil prices, one way of doing it is to demand that the West put more pressure on the Saudis and the Emiratis to stop the war on Yemen, which is extremely expensive for both of these Gulf countries. And the reason I say this is because the Saudis, I mean, this is a very expensive war for them, very, very expensive. The Saudis are using interceptor missiles that cost $1 to $4 million each for each missile to shoot down Yemeni drones that cost about $200 to $1,000 to max $5,000 each. So never before in history has an army spent so much money on ballistic missile defenses, which is why this war has probably cost Saudi Arabia about $324 billion, which is about 2 years worth of Saudi oil exports. So now, because the West has imposed sanctions on Russia for invading Ukraine, the US is running to the Saudis and Emiratis. They're begging them, please increase production in order to reduce oil prices. But the Saudis and Emiratis are refusing. And that's because they've been collaborating with Russia on oil prices for the past 8 years. Why do you think Russia voted, for the genocidal resolution in favor of the Saudi war on Yemen? It's because they're collaborating. They have a modus vivendi. It's a quid pro quo relationship. They both realize that in order to prosecute their wars, regardless of what you think about them, they need high oil prices. So, let's say you want to punish Russia. Let's say, you're dealing with a working class that just hates Russia. I would try and kind of jujitsu that, like use that energy for the cause of Yemen by saying, okay, why not demand that your government pressure the Saudis and Emiratis to end the war on Yemen? That way, these two Gulf states could actually afford to drive down oil prices. And that's going to incidentally hurt Russia. It's going to help the West stave off the inflation from rising oil prices, which hurts the British working class, as you mentioned, to go to your question. And most importantly, it's going to save Yemeni lives. So that's what I would say. Like, let's be realistic about this, and let's address the belt tightening that Western workers are expected to go through.
Although I recall you saying that the straw that broke the camel's back of the Yemeni revolution was when oil prices were they doubled, rose by 200%. I mean, I don't know what it's like over there at the moment, but over here they've probably gone up about 50% in the last couple of weeks. So maybe, maybe the solution is for them to keep driving up and bring the working class towards some kind of, revolutionary fervor. Maybe I'm just being a bit optimistic.
Maybe, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous that, people can't, people having to choose now between fuel, food, heating. I've heard stories here of people's electricity bills going up, tripling from one month to the next, with no sort of end in sight. And, they're liking to blame this on Russia, but it was happening. It was the trend sort of before the sanctions on Russia even came into place. So it's a nice sort of excuse for them. But yeah, I mean, going back to what we were saying before about them, the propaganda sort of trying to moralize this, the sanctions on Russia, and really trying to convince us that we're on the right side of history when we support neo-Nazi battalions in Ukraine, basically like massacring ethnic Russians who've lived in Ukraine their whole lives, and basically I think 14,000 have been murdered over the last 8 years. We're fighting for freedom and democracy and all these sort of great things, and Ukraine's right to join NATO and whatever. But obviously the opposite is true in Yemen. We don't care about freedom or democracy there. We don't care about the rights of Yemeni people to decide for themselves what sort of government they want to have. So how is it that the West and the British media sort of hide and downplay our involvement in this war?
By simply not covering it. When I started opposing the attempts by NATO and the Gulf states and Israel to overthrow the Syrian government, I received a huge backlash from people who had been propagandized into believing that the West had a duty to save the Syrian people from their own government. But when I cover the conflict in Yemen, there's no backlash. There's just indifference, which is why it would actually be much easier to defend Yemen if there was constant propaganda coming out from the Western media to demonize the Ansarullah movement, because then the counter-demonization would actually bring a lot of people on side, and they would see that the Ansarullah movement are a legitimate national resistance movement, and they just want to be left alone. They want foreign troops off their soil so they can be an independent country. Because, if they did actually demonize the Ansarullah movement, and, then we came out and we defended Ansarullah, we get lots of negative attention at first. But then over time, people would see that we're telling the truth, and eventually the propaganda would wear off and people would oppose the war on Yemen. And which is precisely why the Western media chose simply not to cover the war in Yemen. If the conflict in Yemen got the kind of coverage that Ukraine has been getting over the past 2 weeks, then I think public opinion would see that in Yemen, the side that's fighting for freedom and democracy is the Ansarullah-backed government in the capital, Sana'a, and this war would end tomorrow. Like, usually the way it works is that when the West wants to, reverse or overthrow a status quo situation somewhere in the world, then they will use a lot of propaganda to demonize that status quo. So, for example, Syria, the status quo government of President Bashar al-Assad has to be endlessly demonized in order to support every attempt to overthrow that government. But in Yemen, the effective status quo government is the Ansarullah-backed government of national salvation based in the capital, Sana'a. And so, they're trying to kind of
They're not trying to overthrow. They're trying to keep in place their puppet.
They're trying to keep in place their puppet. They're trying to kind of turn back the clock on a revolution. Like the craziest thing about this is that this is the only genuine revolution of the Arab Spring, but it didn't go according to the script. The script is that Muslim Brotherhood governments would come into power in Syria, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and this would be a huge victory for Turkey because they would rebuild their Ottoman sphere of influence. It'd be a huge victory for Qatar. But this didn't happen because, the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, quite frankly, isn't popular. It had more popularity in Egypt, but then they were removed in a coup, largely because Saudi Arabia felt threatened by them because, Saudi Arabia is at odds with Turkey and Qatar. I mean, that's like a separate thing altogether. In Tunisia, they got some electoral gains. And in Yemen, they came to power. They supported Hadi's government, which was acting at on behalf of Saudi Arabia, and then they were removed in a revolution. Like what they wanted to happen in Syria was for the state to defect to the side of the revolution, and for Assad to be ousted as a result. So what they wanted was for the army to defect and basically become the Free Syrian Army, but that failed. Whereas in Yemen, the state actually did defect to the side of the revolution, which is what an actual revolution looks like in the Arab world. Because armies in the Arab world are conscript forces. Like they're just made up of ordinary people who are doing their 2-3 years.
It's not like a calling for people.
Yeah, conscript armies are actually a very revolutionary force throughout history. The Bolshevik Revolution, conscript army, right? And so conscripts are not very good at defending unpopular governments. And so the fact that the conscript army in Syria defended that government and beat back ISIS, al-Nusra, the Free Syrian Army, and the fact that the insurgency in Syria was 70% made up of foreigners, right? And then they won, shows that the actual indigenous side won. Similarly, in Yemen, the indigenous side is winning. The foreigners are losing, even though the foreigners call themselves the legitimate official government.
How long do you think, this will go on? If it's so expensive for the Saudis, I'm sure they can't keep pouring money into this war forever. I mean, how do you sort of see this playing out?
I genuinely do think that there is going to be added pressure on Saudi Arabia from the United States to stop this war if oil prices get too high. If oil prices get to, I don't know how to calculate the prices over there, but here in Australia, the price here in Australia. Here in Australia, it's about $2.15 a liter. I mean, there are some places that
that's
go
still
for
cheaper than it is here. I don't know why. Right? Fuel. I've noticed this. Ever since I moved here, fuel was about £1.40, which is nearly $3 a liter. Before all of this kicked off, it's now up to nearly £2 a liter, which is almost $4. Which is mental, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And it's £50 for a steak or something, right?
It's such an interesting country because everything's so expensive, but also it's a low wage economy, whereas Australia, you have quite high wages, even though it's it's also very expensive, especially property prices.
We have all these resources, but to answer your question, I do think that this is that the oil question is going to force Saudi Arabia to stop this war. I mean, that's maybe it's just hopium on my part, but it's also kind of my activist agency as well. I'm saying to people, I'm saying to people I know, people who have influence, this is the argument that you should be running to the Western ruling classes, because sometimes you do have to kind of step in and say, because I know a lot of Marxists have this dogma where they say it's not up to us to advise policy for the bourgeois state or whatever, right? But I tend to disagree. I think no, it's our kind of obligation to show the way in ways that would benefit ordinary working people. And one way of doing that is to point out that if Saudi Arabia and the UAE stop prosecuting this war that's costing hundreds of billions of dollars, then they can afford to drop the prices of oil. So I'm hoping that we can make that argument. My argument is very simple. If you hate Russia, that's fine. If you really want to own Russia, end the war on Yemen.
It's an interesting, interesting line. I don't know whether many people who do hate Russia will pick up on that line because they pretend to prefer that the war in Yemen's not actually taking place. But I mean, I think it's just so important to continue to agitate on the issue and, you know, just point out the hypocrisy of people who are, you know, going all in on their hatred of Russia because, you know, Ukraine's the biggest humanitarian crisis ever, as if, you know, there hasn't been constant war around the world for the last like 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
As if Iraq hasn't happened, as if the war in Syria hasn't happened, as if the overthrow of Gaddafi didn't happen, as if, you know, this crisis in Yemen isn't still ongoing. So yeah, I mean, it's so important to just continue to expose this to everyone who doesn't know, or those who do know but pretend that it's not happening. And hopefully, you know, it's something that can be taken up more broadly across the working class, because, you know, our interests are in freedom and democracy, and not just for ourselves, but for our Yemeni sort of brothers and sisters too.
And, you know, I wanted to add something, that the kind of people who are becoming anti-war now are very different from the kind of people who were against the Iraq war.
Yeah.
Like, opposition to the Iraq war was very much like a left-wing thing. Like, all of the Cliffites, the Trotskyites, they were against that war, you know, and they campaigned pretty hard. And, you know, good on them, right? But
Yeah.
after Barack Obama came to power, they started supporting every single war that the US is waging. So the invasion of Libya, you know, Socialist Alliance here in Australia supported that invasion. And of course, you know, the other Trotskyite groups. Please.
Oh, and I was just saying, like, I remember studying at uni, like the responsibility to protect idea and this whole humanitarian intervention concept really kind of changed things, and it gave liberals like a justification for them to support imperialist wars. And they just frame everything through that lens now. And people are just, you know, so easy to convince every single time, you know, we lied about that one, but, you know, this is really like, this is the one that we have to support. I mean, most of the groups over here on the Russia question have taken like the sort of trot line of, you know, neither Moscow nor like Washington, but you know, that's because they don't know what's been going on there since 2014. And, you know, the sort of cultural like Cold War never really ended. It's like they've spent the last 10 years really drumming up this sort of Russophobia. So people still think that, you know, where there's the Berlin Wall still exists, and that, you know, those evil Russians are like trying to destroy the West, and people are still sort of in that mindset. But yeah, it's really been taken to a fever pitch over here. I'm glad it hasn't reached you guys yet. I think even like just the Glasgow. Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. I wanted to kind of make a point about like the kind of people who are anti-war. You know, because I think a major shift happened during the Syrian war when the US government was on the verge of invading Syria in 2013 after the fake chemical weapons accusation. And a lot of people from the US Army, they started wearing, like they started taking photos of themselves in their military uniform. They had the American flag behind them. They held up, you know, signs, you know, basically saying, "I will not fight for Al-Qaeda in Syria." And I think what happened from that point onwards is that a lot of people in the US Army who originally joined and became, you know, radicalized, like, you know, for American imperialism, the reason they were radicalized is because they thought that the US was fighting this global war on terror and that the biggest enemy was radical Islam and Al-Qaeda. And when they finally saw that the US was on the side of Al-Qaeda, they thought, well, what's going on here? And it didn't make sense to them. So now a lot of them understand. Like, I have seen, you know, there's a guy called Michael Horton, and he writes for the Jamestown Foundation. And he was interviewing people from the U.S. Central Command, and they are kind of stationed in the Gulf, and they're actually sympathetic to the Ansarullah movement. Like, quite a few people in the U.S. Army who think that the purpose of like the U.S. Army is to fight Al-Qaeda are scratching their heads, and they're thinking, why are we fighting the Ansarullah movement? And, you know, Ansarullah has been fighting Al-Qaeda ever since they were formed. I mean, from the very inception of Ansarullah, the forces that the president Saleh sent to fight against them were Al-Qaeda forces. And now They've managed to drive out Al-Qaeda from large parts of Yemen, right? They're defeating them, and the US is siding with Al-Qaeda, and they're scratching their heads. They're thinking, I don't get this. And so there's a growing anti-war sentiment from within the American military, and it's from like, flag-waving conservatives or like, straight white men.
Yeah.
And so wouldn't you know, there's a massive propaganda campaign against like, straight white men in the military, and they're trying to make it more like, gay and transgender and like inclusive. Nothing against those identity groups. That's not my point. My point is that imperialism always tries to find new identities to support their wars of aggression overseas. So during the Bush era, it was, white Christians, fighting against the
freedom
evil
and
Muslims.
Democracy.
Yeah, exactly. And then
now
now
it's the woke wars.
Now they're all woke wars, right?
Yeah. I know it's quite mental to sort of witness that shift over time. Actually, like one sort of final question I wanted to ask about the Stop the War movement, because I mean it's kind of become a bit limp, especially on this question of Russia and NATO. But what have they sort of said about the war in Yemen? Have they been vocal about it? Has there been, much come out from them? Nothing.
A few people from the Greens have got up in Parliament and said the right things. I mean, Peter Wilson, I think Daniel Alexander, I forget his name, politician from the Labour Party. A few people have said a few good things on Yemen. I will say that, particularly from the Greens. Duncan Spender, who's a libertarian, condemned the war on Yemen here in Australia, but the actual anti-war movement hasn't really touched it at all. And I think, they all know about it, but I think it's partially because they're very reactive. So whatever the media talks about, they talk about, so and it's like with this whole like recent, Russian invasion of Ukraine, the position that they've taken here in Australia, there is like an anti-AUKUS coalition that's been formed, and it was originally formed against, the ramping up of hostilities and tensions with China. They've now kind of started protesting against the Russian invasion, but their line is something like, we're against Russia and we're against NATO. So it's like, we're against both, which is like a useless position to take. It doesn't, because
it's utopian, really. It's not like there's something happening, and like, you can't just say, oh, well, we wish that this wasn't happening. It is happening. You have to basically take a position.
In a war, who you are for is who you are against, and who you are against is who you are for. It's very simple. I would frame it this way. I'd say you don't have to say that you support Russia, because that question really only matters for people in Russia, because they're the ones being conscripted. They're the ones who have to pay higher taxes and deal with the consequences of sanctions. So do we. But the question that we have to ask is, whose fault is this war, right?
Yeah.
Do you blame A, NATO expansion, or do you blame B, Russia? And that's where I say I blame NATO expansion. I don't blame Russia for this.
Yeah. And we should support any action that's against the imperialists, really. That's what it comes down to for me. And if the Russian invasion of Ukraine can, damage NATO, can weaken the power of the imperialists, then, I'm all for that. But I also, I think denazification of Ukraine is like a worthy goal, especially with some of the videos and photos I've seen of street vendors like selling Mein Kampf out on the street, and police doing Nazi salute, sort of just, as a day-to-day activity, with people like not even, being alarmed at what they're seeing. It's just sort of become normalized over the last 8 years. So considering Russia's history with Nazis, they're not going to sort of let it.
They lost 27 million people, and people in the West simply don't understand what that looks like and feels like for the Russians. There's a word, I remember there was a WikiLeaks cable that I read, and this is from like 2009, and this US ambassador to Russia was basically, he used this word called neuralgia, which is like a kind of neurosis. It's like this extreme paranoia and fear that Russia has about, Ukraine joining NATO. And everything he was saying, the US ended up doing. It's like, we should, because the idea is very simple. Ukraine, from an American point of view, has to be flipped against Russia. And the way that you do that is by working with what you have. And what you have are like two different versions of history. One version of history says that the Soviets were liberators and the Germans were the invaders. The other version says the opposite, that the Germans were the liberators and the Soviets were the invaders. And so if you want to flip Ukraine against Russia, it's just inevitable that you have to weaponize the sentiment that says that the Ukrainians who collaborated with the German invasion were nationalists and patriots, and that it's the duty of every Ukrainian to fight Russians and Russian influence and to, de-Russify the country, prohibit the language, persecute pro-Russian politicians. That's a big one. Shut down pro-Russian media. And the point is to turn this country anti-Russia, thereby manufacturing consent for flipping Ukraine into a military base for NATO.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's only been, 2.5 weeks. So, I mean, we'll see how things play out over time. I don't like that we've sort of just gone into the Russia question when we're supposed to be talking about Yemen.
Talking about Yemen, yeah.
Yeah. But,
well, I think,
I was just going to say, to wrap it up, like, what's something that people can do, to show support for the people in Yemen? I mean, I'm not talking about, virtue signaling and putting a Yemeni flag like in your Twitter handle or something, but is there something that you can recommend people do?
There's charity, which is like, it's like not really political, but it does help. So there's this one charity called WF Aid, and they've been like, been involved in sending shipments of food to Yemen and doing the difficult work of negotiating their way past the blockade. Because, every ship that goes to Yemen has to be inspected for like weapons before it's allowed in. But I actually do think media work is very, very important, so reaching out to politicians, like putting in effort to put out content that people in political office can read and digest and can actually put out there. So for example, a lot of what I said, I can imagine would be useful to somebody like, somebody who's in like the US Congress, who wants to figure out a way of like, addressing the fuel price inflation.
Yeah.
It's like, so that particular argument, I think at a time like this is very important to hammer home. And that's why we need good propagandists, artists, people who can deliver that message.
Yeah. Well, thank you for delivering it to us, and hopefully everyone who watches this will take note and will be committed to sort of doing some agitation against the war in Yemen and remembering it and making sure it's front and center of all discussions about Western imperialism. So thank you so much, Jay, for joining us, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.